So this is gonna be a long, probably pretty boring video unless you're replacing a clutch on an old Volvo T24. There are other models that are very similar, the T22 and maybe the 25 and maybe some of the other Forder old pretty mechanical tractors have a very similar build, but it will be interesting with the corona times now and everything shutting down. This it was in some old video where I moved it into the garage, and it's been a little bit of a side project this winter, a few days when it's been too cold or I've been waiting for other parts and have something to keep busy. And in the beginning I made sure to spray all the fasteners that I knew I was gonna remove, because it was bought as a bit of a project, and I have a few plans for it. We'll see if I'm able to realize them, but I knew that the clutch was bad on it when it was purchased. It didn't work one bit, so and if on these old machines to access the clutch you need to pretty much split it apart. Had also found a few small issues looking over it that I wanted to address, and it was mainly cleaning and removing all the easy parts. If you yes, the air filter on it is oil filled, so don't let it tip over. I had it fall over, but I put it in some cardboard. Battery, removing that. For some reason they have added an extra main switch. I have no clue really why. I think it could have had to do with some extra lights they had mounted that were hardwired to the battery, and then they added this extra switch to kill the lights. But that is gone now. I did remove this switch when I had checked that the functionality of the original one was good. There are a few bolts on the back side of the battery box holding the fuel line. I think it's 2 bolts on the top and then 2 more at the bottom. I wonder if my one maybe had a nut on it. Had started looking at removing the muffler, because you can't remove the hood otherwise, and everything is quite well rusted on this one, so it was a little tricky getting in there, and it's a clamp holding it in place. And that bolt I was able to remove, it can release on that one also, but I wasn't sure where it was gonna come undone. Siphoned out most of the fuel. I had noticed that the fuel valve, it's a dual tank. It's can run on either gasoline or kerosene, and had noticed that the fuel valve was leaking. It's seems to be quite common where you switch between the 2 tanks, and I was planning on just skipping that now. There is a band above the fuel tank holding that in place. I needed to remove the fuel tank also to get access to some of the bolts holding the machine to get together to access the clutch. One of the arms for the lights was also kind of loose, and with the tank out of place it was possible to replace the bolt that had come undone and was missing a strap and a bar, and trying to twist the muffler to see if things will start moving, but it feels like it's welded in place. So some heat was added, and then trying to twist again and starting to loosen the clamp a little more, because it was a little bit loose but it wouldn't slide out of the way. More heat. I thought the bolt would break, but eventually it started moving. My dad heating and me is trying to twist, and eventually it came undone. Some wiring up here going to the generator. I kind of just opened up the clamps, holding them in place a little because the bolt looked so rusty. And then the last bolt could be removed and the entire hood could be lifted off. Opened up the inspection cover underneath to see what the movement of the clutch was looking like, and there should be something pressing on the clutch itself. It's quite greasy and so around the engine, and also cleaned up the area where the split of the machine will be. The exhaust is leaking quite badly, and that will come in the future because I have replaced the exhaust manifold also. Removing the last wiring down to the generator, and on the back here I had found that it was leaking quite badly with hydraulic oil. You probably don't need to remove these banjo bolts back here to undo or split the machine. You need to remove the front end next to the pump, but I wanted to get these off to see if I could get them to seal better, and it turns out it's an O-ring sealed banjo special. The throttle actuator needs to be removed, and it was also quite well stuck on there. Then here it's you can adjust the ignition a little on these machines, so there is an arm so you can adjust it from where you're seated. Some heat and applying twisting force, and it started to move a little to be able to get a screwdriver under. There is also a lock pin underneath that was removed before starting to get the pin out. And it gave way eventually. Spring had to be unhooked also. And then I looked at undoing the because I had heated the sensor for the it has engine temperature. Looked on the joint for the steering here in the front because it's better access than the one I need to remove, and there is kind of a lock, little I'm not sure, arch with pins out that needs to be removed. You have to undo the grease fitting and then pulling on the arch a little and pressing in one of the holes, and it just pops right out. And then there is a slotted bolt, so you need a suitable piece, and then you can start twisting it out. Kind of a clever joint here, and I guess you can tighten it up also if it gets a little sloppy over the years to have a tighter feel in the steering. So really a clever, simple solution. Well, maybe it wasn't super simple, but clever at least. Wanted to have better access to that temperature sensor, so removed the heat shield up here. Coolant was also drained. I'd seen that looked really bad and kind of rusty water, it feels like. So I'm gonna flush the coolant systems a couple of times. Started trying to remove that temperature sensor, and this is gonna turn out to be several months. Had my sister and niece visit, playing around in the garage, and it refuses to budge. It doesn't even feel close, and I was just gonna keep spraying that every other day for the next month or two, I think. Had a motorcycle lift with a couple of wood pieces on top to help lift one end. And then we take a little ride in the lift and a bucket. I hope they can come visit more in the future. Starter motor, I have 2 electrical connections and 2 bolts holding that in place. And then seeing that things start to move a little, I had also removed a couple of bolts underneath the fuel tank that are holding things together, and started trying to move things. I thought it was stuck in the axle that feeds into the gearbox, so sprayed that some. Tried adding a few wedges and a little bit of tapping, and it didn't really want to move, so started looking over things. I'd added a lift also to lift up the back end a little bit, and realized I had forgotten one of the bolts. So make sure you have all the bolts removed if you're trying to split a machine. And with them all removed, it was could be rolled apart, just taking care to not have anything snagged. I had also removed that I missed recording the oil pressure line. I have it later on where I refit it, but and here we can start seeing the carnage. I have removed the thrust bearing that pushes on the clutch to start getting parts out. The linkage for the clutch had to be removed. I realized I might not have to remove this arm at all, so that was left in place. Loosened some parts from that bridge thing that presses on it, the circlip, and it could be just pulled out. There are 2 woodruff keys on the axle here that needs to be removed before the axle can come all the way out. And with them out of the way, things slid apart. The axle that transfers the power to the gearbox, and then starting loosening the bolt that's hold the clutch, and it was kind of stuck on there a little because there are some guide pins, but things came apart without too much trouble. And here you can see some serious damage down to the arms that releases the clutch. So time to order some parts. Took the number just to have that. Wasn't sure exactly how that thrust bearing is put together, but it's gonna be replaced anyway, so doesn't really matter. But the tab here is broken that stops it from turning around. New parts arriving. Even if they say this place, I couldn't find any other place really selling parts for these machines, so even if they are not the best, they would probably be quite good. Thrust bearing removed, some heat and so on. There is also a new bearing that sits inside the flywheel that's included in the kit, so even if it didn't really feel super bad, I wanted to replace that, and I also wanted to pull the flywheel out to clean things up. Some tapping once the lock metal had been folded out of the way and came out quite easily. And then it could be removed. Blind bearing puller, and the bearing in there came out without any real trouble. The flywheel itself, on the other hand, was a little trickier. Used the bolt and the blind bearing puller on one side, and on the other there is an inspection cover, so I could use a pry bar and wiggle it back and forth a little, and eventually it came all the way out. It's a pretty hefty piece of metal. I did mark the orientation of this one so I could put it back in this correct order. I'm not sure if it's balanced together with the crank in any way. I don't really think so, but there is grease, like a hose that should attach to this holder for the thrust bearing, but that was broken because of the other damage. So removed the broken one with the Torx. This was back when we had the tractor in the garage with the fuel pump. Put the parts in the sandblasting cabinet to clean things up, to try and weld things. Some cleaning behind the flywheel. I wonder if it leaks a little around the crankshaft, also some engine oil here, but it doesn't seem to be extreme, so I won't address that now. If this machine stay on the property for long enough, it will probably be apart more times. Flywheel back on, new bearing in place. This time it's a sealed bearing. The old one was kind of an open bearing, but there is no way to actually add grease here. Had not marked the lock plate, and that I had to move around a little before it would finally easily slip into place. So tighten those up. I add a little blue Loctite. I tend to do that on almost everything. On the motorcycles I have, everything needs blue Loctite at least. And then folded the tabs back on. The clutch needed some hammering to get the holes to line up on the guide pins. Here I kind of messed up. I should have just placed the axle in place to hold the fiber disc centered, but didn't think about that. So if you do this, put the axle in place to guide the fiber disc, because I tightened things up a bit and realized I couldn't get the axle in, so I had to back things out and get a little clearance so the fiber disc was loose, and then line things up with the axle and then tighten things back up again. Not a big deal, but it could be good to know. So if you're watching this because you're doing some clutch work on an old tractor, and back on spraying that sensor for the engine temperature gauge. We put together some wooden pieces and metal pieces to kind of make a jig for welding that tab back on there. Plenty of heat was added to them because this is a cast piece. Even if we are no experts when it comes to welding, I for sure am not good at all. My dad knows a little bit, but it's mainly by feel. But it seems to hold up the things he welds. So we also heated that fork for pressing on it and added some more metal on it because it was kind of worn. Here my dad had already ground down that one to kind of to a rounded. We had messed up some and ended up welding over the little hole that holds the spring. Don't do that, because weld can be really tough to drill, and it ended up using the Dremel for quite a while because we had broken several small drills, but eventually we were able to make a new hole. So that was a little bit of a mistake. The spring was for sure broken also, so I could find a suitable material to get the new spring sorted out. Started looking at that hose feeding the grease connection, and turned out that the hose had taken damage enough that it couldn't be reused, but to keep the original connections I cut away the hose from the fitting, and that could be drilled out and tapped in a thread suitable to use some of the central lubing parts from the forest machines, and use that kind of hose and get it fitted so it will still work. I just need to make sure to not grease here a lot, because a lot of people grease this truss bearing too much and get enough grease in there that they get it on the clutch and it stops functioning. This one should just have one pump every not very often at all. But At least we're back to looking at assembling things by now. Doing a bit of test fitting to see how things work. Yeah, the pin was also crooked, but we just put a little pipe on top of that and bent it into place. That guide pin you can see, and then there is a little pin that goes through a hole there and holds the spring in place. That's a little hard to see, but if you ever do anything like this, you will figure it out. Here you can see the old mangled spring, and then hammered the new truss bearing in place. Did a little bit of test fitting to see how the grease connection wouldn't interfere with the movement. Had to pull it out a little to get that connection arm behind it and slide the axle in place. But now we had it on and off a couple of times to ensure things were where they should be. When we were satisfied, the woodruff keys were pushed into place. Well, we had to take it out to be able to get access to get the woodruff keys into place. And then we centered the arms, the push arms, before things were tightened up. Did some final measurements to see that the clearance was where it should be, and between the parts I was worried that spinning parts would connect something back there. A little bit of grease on the splines just to keep rust away for a little bit, and then starting to push things together. I'm not sure where it went, but there are a couple of L-shaped things, kind of a transportation thing that's were in the clutch that needed to be removed, but I think I've seen video footage of it, but I'm not sure where. But eventually it might have been there earlier. I'm not sure I'm even gonna view this entire video before posting it, so well, we'll see. And once things were close enough that we could get bolts to go on there, we tightened one on each side. Temporarily put the linkage in place to start feeling where we were at. I had put the fork holding it a lot further out, because I think they've tried doing adjustments here was the clutch was really going bad and damage was being done before things actually broke. And then starter motor, I'm not sure how I got it apart really, but here I used those crow's feet to get access to tighten things up. The bolts at the top underneath the fuel tank that needed to be removed were put back in place. And here is kind of an inspection cover, and I had removed that at an early stage to see what I was dealing with, but couldn't see much, just the back of the flywheel here, and this was quite tricky to get all the bolts back into place. Close the cover underneath the clutch. There is also I think it's to set the ignition or something, a little cover further up that I missed reinstalling. Finding out some new O-rings for those banjo fittings, the hydraulic lines, and some of the O-rings were really bad, and also found quite a bit of damage in one of the seals in the banjo itself. Cleaned up some in the area around the hydraulic connections. Had a round punch and some hammering and kind of forced the material back out a little to get a smoother surface, a better, more room for the O-ring. And I also ended up using some copper washer here. There was some copper washer since before, and seems to someone has tried to address some of the leaking unsuccessfully. And then bending in the pipes and bolting the pump back into place. Realized I have the plans I have for it. I have no real use for a trailer hitch, so just to get a little few things out of the way that I don't see any use for just now, I just unbolted the trailer hitch, taped the bolts into place, and it's gonna be kept somewhere. The filter, it's just a mesh net for the hydraulic system. I just opened that one up when draining the hydraulic oil. I found there is a drain plug also, but I'm not sure the hydraulic oil didn't look all that bad. Here I'm trying to reconnect the oil pressure connection. That gauge seems to work at least a little. And two of the bolts at the bottom have a really tight fit against the clutch housing, so I ended up replacing them with Allen head keys or Allen head bolts, and one of them I had even had to ground down a little to make it thinner. I had found some fuel connections to hook up the fuel tank and bought a T connection, so I'm just gonna put the two tanks together with a T connection and then add a new fuel valve. The fuel filter, I'd purchased a new seal, and it came with a little mesh to filter out bigger things. Turned out it wasn't gonna seal very well, but more on that later.
Ja, bra.
So that was reinstalled. Back on the temperature gauge, and now we're adding some serious heat, and it's been sprayed every now and then for a really long time, and it eventually started moving. They have done some soldering here with adding that electric engine heater, so I wonder if that was causing any issues, but it was just really stuck on there. Boiled some water and checked the temperature and did a test of the new gauge, and then looked a little at, because I want to keep part of the old fuel system with that glass filter, or it's mainly water catcher I guess, but pins that held the hitch. And then I mess up when I cut because I just added the hose as a loop that had filled with some fuel, and now I was shortening the hose and adding that T connection. Now the T connection is in there, and then I'm just gonna go through a new fuel valve and then back up onto the existing fuel piping that goes to the carburetor. Did test that the original main switch seems to function fine. That's when I removed that old one that was in the battery box. Did a little bit of a test fitting to see where things were going, because we were gonna weld the little lip on top of the battery box to fit or secure the new fuel valve. The choke actuator was also broken, so the string inside it was too short. Also found one of the electric connections had come undone, that was stuck on there, so a new ring connection was fitted. The band on top of the fuel tank was reinstalled, and then the battery box could start going in place. Realized the cable to get to the positive terminal was just a little too short now that the other extra circuit breaker was removed. Here we have the new fuel valve installed,
Ja, det kom då i...
and things seem to work for now. The electrical cables, 2 of them, to the starter motor was reattached, and then the throttle linkage had to go back. A linkage for ignition adjustment. That clever steering linkage, my niece had played around and turning the steering around, so it was needed. My dad helped move it so that it could be reinstalled. That nut that presses on there, that clever one, and then that little arch-shaped lock could be put in place. Thought I could just push it by hand, but needed to resort to a hammer to tap it enough to snap into place, and then the grease fitting could be put back. We had gotten hold of some smoke grenades
Ja.
that
Hur
my
länge ska
dad
den
was
där
eager
ryka
to
där? Det är en halvtimme
test
eller?
one,
Oj, eller?
and
Den är inte där.
I was worried things were gonna get orange from it, but that was fine. More will come in a following video, replacing the exhaust and test starting
Det
it.
blir du nog inte med.